you're having a good time with your family and having a good time with what you're doing at home and that type of thing. And I wanted to talk a little bit about King Taharqa today. So I wanted to kind of address you and thank you so much for supporting and joining me. And I want to say up front, for those who are subscribers and members here on YouTube, I'm going to be offering this resource that we're going to go over. I'm going to be talking about a resource today that's going to talk about King Taharqa. And it's going to go a lot with respect to the interactions he had with the Assyrians and what was captured in the Bible. And I'm going to be working to make this this offering available to those who are subscribing to me on Facebook and those who are members here on YouTube. And on YouTube, it's only $4.99 a month, and Facebook's the same thing, $4.99 a month. So I very much appreciate. God bless you, those who supported me, and I am going to be offering this resource. It'll be there available on the site very shortly in the next day or so that you can download if you'd like to look at it. So I'll be offering that to members very soon. So thank you so much. So I wanted to kind of jump in and have this conversation and talk a little bit about King Taharqa. And this is an emblem from him from one of the temples that he built at the foot of Jebel Barka, the pure mountain that's in the Sudan near Napata. I wanted to talk about him a little bit and ask that whole question, did he save Jerusalem? Did King Taharqa save Jerusalem? And it is a famous passage in the Bible where he's mentioned in Isaiah, and we're going to go through that and talk about that now. And it talks about him coming to the rescue, if you will, or coming to the site at a time when Jerusalem was being seized by the Assyrian army. And so I've been reading about this, and I've been looking at this and just kind of reading a lot about it. And as I start to read about it, it really kind of intrigues me. And when you read into it, you understand King Taharqa was a much more important figure in history than we give him credit for. We talk a lot about the 25th dynasty, if you will, the so-called 25th dynasty. We talk a lot about him, and we know he's important, but we really don't really talk about it. And a lot of times when they talk about him being mentioned in the Bible, there's not a lot of deepness that goes into it. And when you start to really dig into it, he deserves a lot more credit and more credence and more studying. And we're going to do some of that today to talk about King Taharqa. So I wanted to jump in here, and I want to thank you who are supporting and jumping. How you doing, Team Z? God bless you. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's good to see you and good to see your thumbs up. There, it's good to depend on you and counting you for seeing and your good comments that you give. So I very much appreciate it. So we're going to talk about him today because I think King Taharqa deserves much more study and much more examination in history and research. And that's what we're going to do. And as I mentioned, for those who are members here on YouTube, it's just $4.99 a month. I'm going to be offering this resource that we're about to go over on our member site. You'll be able to access it. And I'll put this information up on our community tab that you'll be able to see soon in the next, shortly, if you will, next day or so. So I wanted to kind of jump into this and talk about King Taharqa. And you probably know King Taharqa reigned from about 690 BC to about 664 BC. And he was a member of the so-called 25th dynasty. And the only reason why I say so-called 25th dynasty is because they were a dynasty in their own right. A lot of times we tend to define them and talk about them just with respect to Kemet. Nothing else they did in Kush, or nothing else but what they did before they took over Kemet or even after that. So I don't want to just define them with respect to that. So I may say that just so you can know that, but they were a dynasty in their own right. They were a powerhouse and a wonderful family, a very talented family in their own right. And they don't deserve to be just looked at with respect to the time they spent in Kemet when they were controlling Kemet. They were important beyond that. So I want to kind of talk about it. So he was alive during 690 BC, and there was a lot of things that he did and a lot of things he went through. And I kind of talk a little bit about it. He was the son of King Pianki. So we talked about King Pianki a little while ago, and we talked about King Pianki's conquest of Lower Kemet. And so I always want to remind people, it wasn't just King Pianki, it was King Pianki's father and King Pianki's grandfather who also were very instrumental in taking over ancient Kemet and being able to extend Kush's gain, if you will, into the parts of Kemet. So we started talking about this, but he begins to come on the scene at a very young age. And I kind of go through a little bit. He begins to come on the scene at a very young age. And even though he is the son of King Pianki, he is somebody that by the time he's 20 years old, by the time King Taharqa is 20 years old, he's being called into service by one of his royal relatives. So it could have been King Shabaka or it could have been King Shabiktu. He was called into service. So King Taharqa, he's a young man. He is down probably in Meroe. He may have been in Napata or Meroe in the very southern part of ancient Kemet. So right there around, we might see in the southern part of ancient Kemet, he may have been down there. So just to give you some idea, in Upper Nubia, he may have been in Napata, he may have been in Meroe, but he was called away from his area in Kush, and he was called by his relative, either his uncle or one of his relatives, who was the successors of his father, King Pianki. And he was called to go into Kemet and to become a royal official, to be a part of the whole official royal coronary court and all that good stuff. And he was somebody who took on a leadership position at an early age. So he even mentions in one of his stelas that he developed and left in Tanis in the northern part of ancient Kemet. He talks about, it's a beautiful stela, and we'll talk about it at one point in time. He talks about bringing his mother from Napata, that hadn't seen his mother in a long time because he left when he was a youth of 20 years old, and that he left and he'd been away for an extended period of time for his mother. And the whole idea of the kingship and the pharaoh being like Haru or like a bull, and they really respected the parent, the mother being like a cow as well, the mother being a cattle, and the mother being that which gives birth to the king. So he has a beautiful stela that he produced that's in Kemet, that talked about him missing his mother and his mother coming up and seeing him coronated and now being king of Kemet. So there's a whole bunch of things that he did in his life even before he became king. So that's an important for us to think about. So as he's on the scene in history before he became king. And as I look at it, remember, he doesn't become king until 1690 or 690. So he becomes king in 690 to 664. But in 701, there were changes that were taking place in the world. There were changes that were taking place in that part of the world that would affect a lot of things in history. And as we kind of go back and kind of look at it, if you just kind of get an idea and just take a look at that whole area, you start to see that whole area where you see, modern day Syria and modern day Iraq, parts of Iran, in particular Iraq and the northern part of it, the Assyrian Empire and kind of the new Assyrian Empire, if you will, was making its head. It was making this headway and it was coming forth. And the Assyrian Empire, guys, the army of Assyria was a force. And if you read some of the information, because we're going to read some of the specifics around it, there is a whole Annals of Sennacherib, if you will, that's talked about, that we're going to talk about here and talk about some things from that. There's a whole Annals that one of the kings from ancient Syria wrote about his conquest. And when he did his conquest, when they went through parts of what is modern day Iraq, parts of Syria, parts of what's modern day Israel and the West Bank and various places like that, they were brutal. A lot of things happened with respect to the war and with respect to the world, but one of the things the Assyrian army did, and I'm sure the people who can put comments down below who even know more and can share more, but one of the things the Assyrian army did is that they had a standing army that was much more professional than traditional people at that time. A lot of people, and it's interesting because when I read about it, when you read Strabo and you read him talk about ancient Kemetic people a long time after this, he talks about Nubian people and Kushite people. A lot of the people in Nubian and Kemet were not they were not heck bent on just killing people. They were not, even though they had a lot of people. Strabo famously mentions, and I'll talk about this even at a later time, he mentions before the Roman army interacts with Amanirenas and Kush years later after this event, he mentions how there are so many thousands and thousands, so many people of Nubian origin and in Kemet, but they don't seem to be geared towards fighting. They don't seem to be geared towards war. And he's like, it's just amazing to me. He can't fathom why you have this many people around and they're not like trying to take over everything. They're not like trying to kill each other. They're not like trying to take over their neighbor. It kind of strikes him as kind of odd. But when it comes to the Assyrians who are long before that, they don't have that issue. They are not necessarily, looking at Ma'at and how do I treat people. I don't know if they had a Ma'ating thing or not, but to my knowledge, I don't think they did, but I don't know if they did. But I know that the Kemetic people and the Kushite people were, and they weren't necessarily looking to kill people. But the Assyrian army, they were taking things, they were known for killing people and impaling them and putting them and hanging their bodies on a pole. Some of the people who fought against them, even some of the people who later fought against them in Kemet, when they won, they took people and they basically skinned them alive. They skinned them alive, talked about it, bragged about it, and would put their bodies on the outside of the walls of the cities that fought against them. So imagine that, taking somebody and literally skinning them alive and hanging them on the outside of the wall so the people inside the city in the area would see that you're the city who fought against me. This is what's going to happen to you. So this is the kind of army that King Taharqa would go up against. And this is the kind of army that was marching. And they were using weaponry with iron. A lot of people around the world, as we know, were smelting iron. In Africa, in the Middle East, in very many places, for hundreds of years by this time, the Assyrian army did much more with it in terms of their weaponry than maybe some other armies did. So they had heavier equipment. they had swords and weapons that would break other people's swords. So they were that type of army. And so they mentioned, it talks about, and you guys can jump in as we kind of look at this, but it talks about in a various archaeological findings and various things with respect to the Bible and various things like that. It talks about around approximately 722 BC, the Assyrian army had laid siege and attacked Israel. And as you probably know, that when we talk about Israel and Judah, they're two different places, just so we can have our perspective in terms of what we're talking about and where King Taharqa came in. God bless you, Pan Africa Designs and Apparel. God bless you. Hopefully you're doing well. God bless you. And Team Z. If you look at Israel, after Solomon became king and after Solomon died, you probably know that the country split. So the 10 tribes of the northern part of Israel developed their own country, and the two Judah and the two other tribes, remaining tribes, had their city, if you will, in their state in the southern part, which they called Judah, and their capital was Jerusalem. In the northern part, in Israel, with the 10 tribes in the northern part, their capital was Samaria. In 722, the Assyrian army attacked Israel. And they were attacking other people. It wasn't just Israel. They were attacking people in this whole area. They were attacking. And apparently they ransacked. They killed a lot of people in the northern part of Israel. And they basically destroyed the capital city. The capital city of the state or the country of Israel was Samaria. The capital city of Judah was Jerusalem. And they destroyed Samaria. And apparently, if you look at this, you can look it up and kind of do your own research on it. When the Assyrian army would attack people, they typically would absorb those people into their country. So they would take people that they may attack, let's say in Israel, and they would take the people, force them to come with them, and then disperse them in various parts of the empire to divide them, to make sure that they would never kind of come back together again to rise up and revolt. So that was one of the ways to ensure that the people that they destroyed, if they felt they needed to do this, would not come back at them. They take them and separate them and put them in different parts of the empire, so they wouldn't have a large enough group to reform a revolt, which is kind of like what they did. It was kind of smart what they did. So that ends up becoming what a lot of historians refer to as the lost tribes of Israel. If you hear about the lost tribes of Israel and you want to research it, it has a lot to do with this Assyrian empire that came in 722 and destroyed Israel, and basically took the people there, absorbed them to the Assyrian empire, and sent them in various places throughout the Assyrian empire, and you never heard from them again. They're lost to history. That's why they call them the lost. They basically were absorbed into the Assyrian empire. And I remember reading about this as a child and never hearing it explained that way. Never hearing, being confused as a child when they said Israel and they said Judah. Why were they talking about two countries? Why did they separate? Why did they disperse? Why is the story focusing on Judah from now on and Jerusalem and not the other tribes? What happened to them? Well, this is what happened to them. They lost to the Assyrian army, and the Assyrian army destroyed their capital, absorbed them into their country, and moved them in various places throughout the Assyrian territories. And the Assyrian army would variously fell as well. So you end up having that being described as what the lost tribes of Israel are. So when you think about that, as that started to happen, you have a situation now where things are serious. You have a situation now where the Assyrian army is a threat. And by the time 701 comes around, King Taharqa is now a young person. He is in ancient Kemet. He is at the head of the army of the Kushites and the Kemetic army. So he's controlling the whole thing. Obviously, the Kushites were controlling at Kemet at this time, and King Taharqa is ahead of him. He's not king yet. Remember, he doesn't become king until 690, but he is the head of the army. And when he becomes the head of the army, what happens is in 701, the king of Assyria basically lays a siege on now Jerusalem. He is going through the area that is Judah. And if you look at Isaiah, and a lot of this is captured in Isaiah and 2 Kings, if you look at the area that talks about this in Isaiah, you'll see Isaiah and the prophet and the people who were writing the person who's writing this book will talk about how they could see, the towns from afar off that may be going up in smoke, and hear the cries and hear all the commotion from the Assyrian army as they approach Jerusalem. And so the Assyrian army was not playing. They were destroying city after city after city, killing places, and they were expecting you to come under their tribute. You were going to pay them tribute, and you were going to become a part of the Assyrian army. And they took no prisoners. Like I told you, it was, pretty much, well, if they had to take prisoners, they would, but they took no prisoners, so to speak, and that they were flaying people and skinning people alive, putting people's bodies on poles and doing all kinds of horrible things. So they were significant, and they were coming to Jerusalem in 701. And I'll read you what the Bible says about it. And you can read this in Isaiah 36. And coming from a King James Version. He's talking about, it came to pass on the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, came up against the defense cities of Judah. So he's going to come through, and he's not just taking, there are more cities than Jerusalem and Judah. And he's taking those cities. And as he's taking those cities, King Hezekiah is the king at the time. And he's taking those cities, and there's a person that the king of Assyria sends, and he sends a messenger to Hezekiah and to talk to the people who are guarding the walls. And he basically says, what are you doing? You're here, and who do you think you're going to put your trust in? Where do you think you're going to be able to save? Everybody's God, everybody who you hear crying, all these cities that said they were going to stop the Assyrian army, none of them are stopping because they're literally killing everybody. They're killing everybody. Like I said, they're skinning people alive. Nobody has been able to stop the Assyrian army. You are trusting in God, or are you going to trust in this place, Egypt? Are you thinking that the king of Egypt is going to come to you and you're going to put your trust in him? Do you think that he's going to give you horsemen and bring you chariots and somehow save you from the Assyrian army? And he said, don't trust Egypt. Don't trust the king of Egypt, because he's going to be like a reed that pricks your hand if you lean on him. At this point in time, he's talking about the 25th dynasty. He's talking about King Shabaka or Shabiktu. He's talking about Taharqa's family, right? Who are in control of all of Kemet and all of Kush. So that's who he's talking about. He's referring to them. He's saying, are you going to trust them that they're going to come help you? So it appears to be, a lot of historians will talk about there possibly being an alliance between the Kushite people and the Jewish people who were in Jerusalem. And so as he talks about this, you can see him continue to talk. Are you going to trust the king of Egypt? Are you going to trust him? And he starts to talk about, this is the depiction of King Taharqa in his temple at Jebel Barco. But he said, if you say to me that you trust in God, is it not he whose high places, King Hezekiah has taken away? And are you not asking people to worship other gods? Who are you going to rely on now? Do you really think that you're going to be able to get the king of Egypt and the Egyptians to come and to bring you chariots and horsemen? So he begins to laugh, and he begins to say, we didn't just come here to talk to you. We came here also to scare your people, and that you're going to be eating your own dung and drinking your own excrement and things of that nature, because that's how much fear we're putting into the hearts of people. So we're talking about an army that at this time was maybe the best, if you want to say armies, the best army, the most well-trained, well-equipped, and maybe vicious army the world had ever seen, or certainly one of the most. And so they're coming to attack Jerusalem, just like they had attacked Israel and this country of Israel, some decades before. They're coming to attack Jerusalem, and they're taking cities. They're killing people who are part of Judah, who are Jewish people. They're killing them, and they're putting them in the Assyrian Empire. And so they're coming to do the same thing with Jerusalem. And as he goes on to talk here, he's talking, I'm here to get you. It's not just going to be me, but it's going to be you that I'm going to get. And he talks about, the Hezekiah sending messengers to Isaiah, the prophet, and asking Isaiah, what should we do? And the Bible goes on to say this. He says, and Isaiah said to them, don't be afraid. You should not say unto your master, thus saith the Lord, be not afraid of the words that you've heard wherewith the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed. They've been blasphemous. Don't pay attention to them. Behold, I will send a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. This is what he says. And then it goes on Isaiah 37. Then the messenger returned, and when he returned, he found the king of Assyria warring against Libnah, for he had heard the news and departed Lachish. And Lachish was a part of Judah. It was a part of Judah. And so the king of Assyria had left. And then it says, and he heard saying concerning Taharqa, king of Ethiopia, he was coming forth to make war with thee. And when he had heard that, he sent messages back to Hezekiah. So a message was sent to Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, that Taharqa was coming. And that Taharqa, king of Ethiopia, and at this time he's king of Ethiopia and king of Kush, he's king of the whole area, that he's coming to fight the Assyrians. Now, what type of stuff is this, right? Taharqa is coming, and he's fighting the most powerful army in the world. He's coming, and he's coming at a time when Jerusalem is being sieged. And the question is, does he do this on purpose? Does he do this to help the people from Jerusalem? Has somehow the king of Hezekiah or Hezekiah, or does somebody give a message to the Ethiopians and to the Kushite people to come help, to bring the Kemetic army and the Kushite army to help them? What takes place here? And the interesting part about this is just not talked about in the Bible. It's talked about in the Bible, but it's also talked about in other areas as well. And we're going to talk about that right now. It's mentioned in the Annals of Sennacherib. Now, Sennacherib, as I mentioned, is the is the person who is the king. And as the king of Assyria, he was somebody who, as a lot of people, he was kind of like, arrogant, if you will. And he wrote, as many of them did, he wrote down his accounts of his military exploits. He wrote down how he was kicking people's butts and all these things he was doing. He wrote down, and many of his exploits that he wrote about, many of his exploits were successful. I mean, there's historical evidence, not just in the places themselves and not just what he talked about, but also in Babylonian records and other records that show that he was actually kicking a lot of people's butt. He was actually destroying a lot of places. And you can read in the Annals of Sennacherib, and you can see this by Luckenbill here that was written a while ago, well over 100 years ago, his interpretation of it. But you can read an interpretation of the Annals of Sennacherib, and it gives you some very interesting information, which we're going to go about and talk about right now. So he starts to talk about it in the Annals that Sennacherib wrote. He's talking about his campaign. And he's talking about how he's going up against the king of Judah. And he talks about that there are people in this area who are going up against him, who are not basically bowing to him, who are not just giving in, who are not just, opening up their gates and letting him in. They're actually fighting back. And he mentions that there was a group of people called Ekron, and that they took their king who had sworn a vow to Sennacherib, and they basically put their king in chains. And they sent their king because he was loyal to the Assyrians. They sent them to Hezekiah in Jerusalem, and Hezekiah locked them up. And so therefore, Sennacherib thought that Hezekiah and Jerusalem were doing this unlawfully, and they were taking somebody who was on his side and keeping him against his will and against his power, if you will, and basically defying the Assyrian army, if you want, the Assyrian king. And he says to them, this is very interesting. This is the part I want to share. He said, Hezekiah held him in prison, talking about the king, this king from Ekron, as if Padi, which is the man's name, had been an enemy. Hezekiah had become afraid and had called for help upon the king of Kemet, right? And the bowmen and the chariots and the corps and the cavalry of the king of Ethiopia, an army beyond counting. And they actually had come to their senses. And so here is Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, saying in his annals, right here in his annals on this prism, in his annals of his military exploits, that Hezekiah, the Jewish king, was holding this king illegally, in his opinion, and that he had called upon Kemet, and that he had called upon the cavalry of Ethiopia and the chariot, and that they had an army that was beyond counting, and that they actually came to their assistance, that the Kemetic army under the charge, the Kushite army under the charge of Taharqa, came to the assistance of the Jerusalem people. That's how Sennacherib put it. Now, I don't know why he would have a reason to lie. I don't know why he would have a reason to make this up, if you will. But here he is, and this is a separate account of the same biblical story that's being told. And here he is talking about Taharqa at the head of the Egyptian, the Kemetic, and the Kushite, really the Kushite army, coming to the assistance of Hezekiah in Jerusalem. And he talks about, of course, Sennacherib talks about here that he meets Taharqa in battle, and he talks about beating him. But when you stop for a second and think about it, and a lot of historians have had conversations about this, what it would have happened if the Assyrians, instead of being either distracted or for whatever reasons, because they were around Jerusalem and they would look like they were about to attack, for whatever reason, they were called away. The Bible talks about there being a miraculous disease or pestilence that broke out against them and killed a whole lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people. Sennacherib talks about perhaps the Ethiopians, the Kushite people under Taharqa, and he mentions Taharqa by name, coming to the assistance of the people at Jerusalem. And he talks about how he beats Taharqa. That's what he says. But if Taharqa, what would have happened if Jerusalem had fell? What would have happened if the Assyrian army had destroyed Jerusalem just like they destroyed Israel years before? What would have happened to the whole idea? Would Christianity have come about? Would we have Islam? Would there be would Judaism have developed the way it developed? Would the world be different? I mean, when you talk about it, people really start to think about this, and you start to say, wait a minute, that was a significant thing. What happened and what significantly happened? So a lot of people, historians will debate, but you can see right here, Sennacherib saying that the Ethiopian army came and that they actually came to their assistance, referring to Hezekiah and how Hezekiah was keeping this king unlawfully, illegally, according to Sennacherib, according to the Assyrians. And he talks about that they met in the plain of Tekka, and that their battle lines were drawn up against me, he says, and they sharpened their weapons. So the Kushite people sharpened their weapons. They were there with Kemetic people, and they had chariots and horses and men fighting. And Sennacherib goes on to say that he beat them. He goes on to say that, that the Ethiopian charioteers were captured, that he captured Ethiopian, chariots and their charioteers and some Kemetic chariots as well, that he captured them. And these were the charioteers of the king of Cush. He mentions them by name, and he talks about, defeating them there. But the interesting about it, this is Taharqa, a younger Taharqa around 701, and Taharqa's not king yet. And even though Sennacherib in his annals says that he wins, Taharqa goes on to live for years and years and runs Kemet and runs it very prosperously, actually, for decades before he faces the Assyrian army again. And so this is an interesting thing. So sometimes you look at it in this propaganda. Sometimes you have to look at it in slightly different ways. But he goes on here to talk about, whatever happens with this, whether this was, King Taharqa saving them in 701, whether this was a miraculous thing that happened, we do know that King Taharqa lived to tell about this, and that he would not become king until, as I mentioned, 690 BC and he died in 664 BC. So as we talk about this, the Bible, as I mentioned, talks about the angel of the Lord coming and defeating the Assyrian army. In the Sennacherib annals, if you will, he talks about Hezekiah being terrified of him, that Hezekiah, had brought troops and elite troops to Jerusalem to protect him, and that at the end of the day, Hezekiah ended up paying tribute to him. So Sennacherib does not talk about beating Jerusalem or Hezekiah in a battle. He talks about no battle. The Bible mentions no battle. The Bible mentions a miraculous thing. But Sennacherib mentions the Ethiopians, the Kushite people, Taharqa, coming to the assistance and him fighting them and beating them there. And so you have this idea that perhaps no battle took place and something happened that stopped Hezekiah from being killed and stopped the city of Jerusalem from being attacked, because they actually did end up attacking. They sieged them, but stopped short of attacking them. And then it talks about King Hezekiah basically paying all types of tribute, bringing, talents of silver and gold and large and stones and all this precious ivory and his own daughters. I mean, I didn't even know that, bringing his own daughters to Sennacherib and the Assyrians, that he brought his daughters and his concubines and even his personal messenger and male and female musicians. He brought all those things and gave them to Sennacherib and to the Assyrians as a part of his tribute. So we do know that took place. But the interesting part about it is that King Taharqa goes on for a period of time after this, and he's fighting. There's a period of time where he is running Kemet after this encounter with the Assyrian army in 701, and he's kicking butt. And he is back in Kemet. He's back in Cush. He's building monuments. He's making additions to the temple at Karnak. He's enlarging the sacred lake there at Karnak. He's building temples in the temple of Mut and the temple of Hedaru in Napata, right? He's building that monument on top of the pinnacles. He's doing a lot for the next several decades before he faces the Assyrian army again. So as we see that, and we kind of jump into, God bless you, I'm holding on. There you go. We saved so many civilizations that it's a lot. I think that he really needs to be talked about more in history. The interesting part about this is as I kind of look at it, he then, as he's moving forward, and we talk about what Sennacherib is doing, they move forward, and you find that not only does he first interact with the Assyrians in 701, he fights them. The Assyrians say they won, but as I mentioned, Taharqa still lives for decades after that, doing amazing things in Cush and in Kemet. And then the Assyrians come back, right? So as I mentioned, this was when you read, literally, if you read the Annals of Sennacherib, and there's also, and I'll put the references for the people who are, if you are, I thank you so much for being supporters and being members. I'll put the references down here, but there's also another book that you can read and document you can read called The Ancient Near Eastern Text of Documents that are related to the Old Testament. I have the reference in this document here, but it talks a lot about, you can read not just Sennacherib's annals, you can read his successors, so his son and his grandson, and they talk about taking their enemies who made certain oath and cutting out their tongues. They talk about, like I said, hanging people from walls once they're skinned alive. They talk about all kinds of really crazy things. When you think about it, the Assyrian army was no joke. They were kind of crazy. They were kind of sadistic if you think about it. And when they came, if you defeated them or you faced them off, or if they wanted Kemet, because they definitely wanted Egypt, they wanted Kemet as a part of this empire. When you think about the empire that they were building and putting together. They wanted Kemet to be a part of that. They mentioned Nubia time and time again. When they mention Kemet, they mention Nubia. They say Nubian. They mention both of them, the names in their language for those areas. They wanted this as a part of their empire. So when they go back and they come back to Taharqa, they come back having known that they met him in battle, knowing that Taharqa is still there and that the army of Kush is strong. And they come back, and then just to kind of show you, Sennacherib, the king of the Assyrian king who had attacked Jerusalem and was going to attack Jerusalem and tried to siege him, he died. He died in 681. So he reigned from about 704 to be 705 BC, 704 BC to about 681, and he died. And his son here took over. So he took over, and he kind of picked up what his father left off. So you will find that in 674 BC, Sennacherib's son comes and attacks Kemet, and when by this time 674, Taharqa is king. He's king of Kush. He's outright king. He's no longer just living in the footsteps of his uncle or his royal family and heading the army. He's king of all of Kush and all of Kemet. And the son of Sennacherib, Issachar, comes in and he attacks Memphis. He attacks the northern part of ancient Kemet. So he's attacking up in the north, not in the south. He's attacking the northern part of Kemet. And it's interesting because in this first battle, when he comes to attack King Taharqa is ready. He comes and he meets the Assyrian army in the northern part of his country, the northern border of ancient Kemet. He meets them and he repels them. Their attack that they try to make when they came into Memphis, or they try to come to Memphis, King Taharqa was able to defeat them. Now, there aren't a whole lot of people, there aren't a whole lot of armies in this time of the world, in this time period, in this part of the world that fought the Assyrian army and lived to live. There are not a whole lot of armies that fought the Assyrian army and turned them away. I'm telling you, like, some of the things they talk about they did to people, and there's evidence that they did them. And here's King Taharqa meeting them twice and not dying himself both times. And in the first time, either it was a standstill or maybe the Sennacherib won. But whatever happened, if Taharqa was coming to help save the Israelites, as according to the Sennacherib's information, saying he was there to give them assistance, if he did, it worked. Something happened. Jerusalem didn't fall. And they were able to continue, and Taharqa was able to return to Kemet and to Kush and to be a ruler for years and years before the Assyrian army came back. And when they came back again, as I mentioned, they came in 674, and this time it was the son of Sennacherib, and he was defeated. He was turned back. He was not able to get into ancient Kemet in the northern part. And here is Taharqa turning them back. Like, that's an amazing thing. And you got to remember, the type of weaponry and the type of army that the Assyrian people had was significant. And so this wasn't a major accomplishment that Taharqa did. But things wouldn't change. They would continue to do this. And so after he lost the first time in the son of Sennacherib, he comes back again. He loses in the 674. He was not able to get the delta, that area in the northern border of Taharqa's land. He comes back in 671. And when he comes back in 671, he makes his way through the delta. He goes to Memphis, Hecapata or Memphis. He goes there and he takes over. And he wounds Taharqa. He fights. He may even take part of Taharqa's family. But they fight and the Assyrians win. And so when you think about and you start to hear about the beginnings of the 26th dynasty, and I know a lot of people in the chat below know about the 26th dynasty, here's where the 26th dynasty begins to take shape. Because the Assyrians, when they kicked Taharqa after this third meeting, him meeting the Assyrian army for the third time, after this third meeting, they kicked Taharqa and send him back basically south, and he kind of goes back to Waset and Thebes, the southern part of Kemet, and they put in place some local leaders. They put in place local leaders that are now going to basically be vassals. They're going to be puppets, if you will, of the Assyrian army. And the Assyrian army is not playing. You do what we say, and you take oaths. You take oaths to their God Ashur. You take oaths to us. And when you take an oath, you take an oath. And if you don't go back on an oath, you're dead. Like, you're dead a horrible death. And so they set up people in the northern part of Kemet that will eventually become the 26th dynasty, the beginnings of the 26th dynasty. And so as they do this is 671 BC. This is the third encounter that Taharqa has with the Assyrian army, apparently. And then what happens is Taharqa doesn't give up. In 679 BC, Taharqa comes back. 669 BC, Taharqa comes back. He's in the southern part of Kemet. He's gathering his troops. The Assyrian army, like I said, came in, and this is after the third encounter, beat them and kicked them out of Memphis. And They put up puppet governments, if you will, and puppet, kings, if you will, and they left their people in charge. And King Taharqa is like, I'm not giving up. He assumes his troops. He gets his Nubian troops, his Kushite troops. He gets his Kemetic troops that are there in Upper Kemet. He gets his troops together, and they go back and launch another offensive in Lower Kemet, in the northern part of Kemet. So King Taharqa comes back, and when he comes back this time, he takes over. Those people that were the puppet figures that were put in place in the governments, they were now under Taharqa control. He regains control of Memphis. A lot of times when people talk about Taharqa's fights with the Assyrian army, they don't talk about this detail. They just tell you that in 671, they lost to the Assyrian army. They don't tell you that they fought him before, or that he came back after that and reassumed control, right? A lot of people just skirt over that, which I think that's part of the story. It gives you a part of the character of the man, and that this was a fight. This wasn't a small fight, and that the Kushite army was a formidable army because they're fighting up the Assyrians that were killing everybody and killing a whole lot of people. And so he comes back in 669, Taharqa, and he takes over the northern part of ancient Kemet, and he's in control again. And so now, the Assyrian army, they want Kemet. Everybody wanted Kemet. I don't care if you were the Romans or the Greeks or the Persians or the Assyrians or whoever, you wanted Kemet. And so here's Taharqa back in control. It's 669 BC, and the same gentleman, the son of Sennacherib, is going to come back. He's going to come back to northern Kemet to try to take over again. And when he tries to take over again, this time he dies. The son of Sennacherib, who Taharqa just fought, he dies. He dies before he can come back to Kemet to face Taharqa. So he can't do it. And then what ends up happening, his son takes over, and his son is called Antiparal. His son takes over, and his son begins to come back. And so after his son takes over, and I'll kind of give you some Ashurbanipal here. That's the son. That's the grandson of Sennacherib and the son of Assyrian. He begins to take over in his father's stead. And when he takes over, he comes back into ancient Kemet in 664. And this time he wins. This time he brings all kinds of forces, because you got to say this is like the third or fourth time, at least the third time that they're coming into Kemet. And each time they come with a little more firepower. They come better prepared. They come with additional plans, and they're not giving up, because that's all they do. They literally are like one of the first countries in the world that we know of, and you can correct me if there's additional ones that you know about, that are a war country. They're just bent on war. This is a country that made its living off of war, and that's what they did over and over again. So even though they came back to Kemet several times, they were going to keep coming back, and they came back better prepared, with more men, more resources, more tools. And at this time in 664, they beat Taharqa, and they beat Taharqa again because he had reassumed control in 669. They come back in 64 and they destroy Memphis, and this time they go all the way down to Thebes and Waset, and they begin to sack that area as well, even though the Taharqa's successor, Temwet would come and take over again. So this becomes like a back and forth that Taharqa is having with the Assyrian army. So here's a man who fought the Assyrian army like 3 or 4 times, right? And in Sennacherib, in the annals of Sennacherib, he talks about in not just his annals, but in the annals of his grandson and his son and his grandson, they talk about meeting Taharqa, and one of them talks about shooting arrows directly at Taharqa themselves and wounding him 5 times, that he was wounded in battle, but they still weren't able to kill him. Here is a man who fought the Assyrian army like 4 times and lived. He took a couple of defeats and he took some victories too. Here's a gentleman that fought the Assyrian army 4 times and lived. A lot of times people will talk about Taharqa and just say he lost to the Assyrian army and do not tell the deepness of the story. The story goes a lot deeper than that. And so not only was he there to fight the Assyrian army several times, and it would be his successor, Temwet, who would, after Taharqa died in 664, he would reassume troops, and he would go back up north, and he would take over the north again. The Kushites were fighters. He would take over the north again until another round of Assyrian attacks would come and kick the Kushites out, kick them all the way back into Napata, back into Kush, or Nubia proper, if you will. So that was after 4 or 5 times, several times of facing the Kushite, the Assyrian army head to head in battle with the Kushites, and it becomes significant. So not only is Taharqa doing this, but he did it at a time when ancient Israel and ancient Judah and Jerusalem was being attacked back in 701 BC and were besieged by the most powerful army in the world. And according to their indications, according to the Annals of Sennacherib, Taharqa came, they responded and they came to their assistance. So it's something that we think about. I know people are going to have differences of opinion. You feel free, but the idea is that this man did a lot more than we give him credit for. And here's a man who fought, the most powerful army in the world at the time and fought them 4 times and lived to tell about it. So I just wanted to share that. I want to kind of get that information out there with respect to Taharqa. There are many other things that he did in terms of building things and various things he did at the Temple of Karnak, like I said, at Jebel Barko, in various places, in addition to fighting them. And there were other people he fought, other wars that he fought that he won, right? So this is a significant man, I think, who was a warrior, who was living in a place that wasn't bent on war and fighting one of the most well-equipped, well-trained armies in the history of the world at that time, in particular at that time. So I just wanted to share that. Please let me know your thoughts and your comments. I'll be back at you with more. God bless you. And I thank you so much for listening. God bless you.